I mean, I think one of the most interesting things to come out of this morning's session was the kind of very entangled relationship and the research program generally between what's being researched, the kind of subject of inquiry, and of course the nature of the process, and how the idea of deviating or deviance might be understood in both those contexts, in terms of the histories we're looking at, the subjects we're looking at, and in terms of the way that we look at those histories, or the way that we embody those histories or be with those histories. I think as the day goes on, and particularly in this next session, that entanglement becomes even closer and more enmeshed. And so this is 3 projects that we kind of loosely grouped under this term. Constituencies. Constituencies is a term that we, along with other museum colleagues, partners, have been using more and more to describe our publics, our users, the people that we speak to and with, that we would understand in kind of political terms as the people that you need to take along with you as you make an argument to them, the people that you serve. So thinking about how different projects work with different publics. So I'm really pleased and delighted to introduced as the first speaker after lunch, Sam Ashby. Sam uses pronouns he, him. Sam is a British artist, graphic designer and publisher. Since 2010 he has collaborated with writers, academics and artists on his publication Little Joe, a magazine about queers and cinema, mostly, he says. His first film, The Colour of His Hair, premiered at International Film Festival Rotterdam in 2017 and won the Best Documentary Prize at London Film Festival in 2018. Sam, the floor is yours.
Email to Jonesy, 11th of October 2018, 1:41 p.m. Hi Jonesy. The gay fetish club I'm researching was started by a Dutch gay activist group called Rosa Driehoek, Pink Triangle, who formed in Eindhoven in the late 1970s. By some point in the early 80s, the local council had given them a space to organise from, where they held meetings and published their own newspaper. Their particular style of activism and aesthetics was heavily influenced by the Italian philosopher Mario Mieli and his book Homosexuality and Liberation, which they bootlegged a Dutch translation of and sold without permission. And so the group were interested in expanding their own and others' polymorphous perversity. This led them to open up their space to local fetish groups who needed somewhere to explore their kinks. And that's how the club was born. They adopted the name Vagevuur, Purgatory, because the building was on a street called Himmelrijken, Heavenly Realms. One member of the group, Harry, was instrumental in turning Vagevuur into a club, and it was soon attracting all kinds of kinks. Sadomasochism, fisting, spanking, leather, water sports, rubber, military, and scat. It was, as far as I'm aware, a men-only space with a strict dress code, although they later organised mixed queer nights. Something that I'm interested in exploring is that the club was a volunteer-run, non-commercial space, which seemed to have been a big part of its popularity. Indeed, this is remembered very fondly and in stark comparison to commercial fetish clubs by men who have been describing their experiences at Vagevuur to me. Besides the fetish nights, Vagevuur also ran a bed and breakfast for visitors from further afield. It had dormitories with military-style bunks. And the space also hosted film screenings, fetish art exhibitions, live music, and even theatre productions. Vagevuur also published a beautiful zine called Itch, a photography book, and in the late 90s began producing their own porn films, with each title dedicated to a different fetish. The club closed in 2008 after a very public scandal about the club's support from the local council, which broke on the evening news, leading to death threats. Harry, the club's owner, closed Vagevuur as he could no longer guarantee a safe space. Harry is not participating in my research. He told me that he has closed that period and moved on. My interest initially was surface. I had heard rumours about Eindhoven having the dirtiest gay club in the world, and here I was on a residency in Eindhoven, exploring rural queer networks. It was irresistible, really. But the process of detective work that took me into this story necessarily brought me up against the material, the subjects, the kinks, and most importantly, the people. The experience of being in a new city, and that of the research itself, felt more embodied than I've ever encountered before. And I began to explore my own relationship to fetish and kink, which seemed to happen naturally rather than feeling forced. Before long, I was being bound, gagged, spanked, pissed on, certainly things I've experienced before. But in this current context, it felt different. A connection to this history that I was exploring, and also something opening up, a space I wanted to explore more. My first month ended with a meeting with a local photographer called John, who did a lot of work for Vagevuur and was a regular at the club. My encounter with him was extraordinary, an intergenerational imparting of experience from one sub to another. And so here I am now, with what feels like many layers of narratives, unsure exactly what form it should take and how much of myself I should bring into it. I am not at all interested in hypermasculinity, and I struggle with the concept of men-only spaces and dress codes. And so the question of separatist spaces, safe spaces, etc. is coming up in the research too. I was wondering about your own journey to exploring this subject in your own artwork, and indeed the development of your work in general. Here's to corresponding. Sam. In an attempt to make contact with other people connected to Vagevuur, I joined Recon, an online gay hookup app for gay men into leather, rubber, BDSM, and kink. I named my profile Vagevuur, uploaded a photograph of myself, and wrote, "Hello, I'm an artist visiting Eindhoven. I'm developing a project about Vagevuur, the fetish club which closed in 2008. I'm interested in speaking to men who visited the club in order to collect memories about it. I will respect your anonymity. Please don't hesitate to get in touch." It wasn't long before I was getting replies from guys curious about why I was interested in the club. Many of them were happy to tell me about their experiences and the nights that they had frequented. All of them spoke fondly of the place and lamented its closure. Sites like Recon seemed to stand in for a lack of cruising space in the area, allowing for guys to explore their fantasies in private. But it was hard to imagine how the online community translated to the real world without a meeting place like Vagevuur. A couple of guys mentioned a club called The Boots in Antwerp, just over an hour's drive away. I received a message from CBT Active. "I was a member of Vagevuur Society. What is your project precisely about and what do you plan to do?" His profile shows off a remarkable array of cock and ball torture devices, or gadgets as he calls them. All handmade, the craftsmanship is remarkable. Wooden cocks and balls are pushed through holes in leather-covered boards and bound hard against the flat surface by nylon ropes, slim like laces, which are looped through the small metal rings, crisscrossing the shaft as if caught in a cat's cradle. Balls are stretched away from the body by rope wrapped around the scrotum, each loop of rope pulling the balls further and further away from the body. In one image, specially made clamps compress testicles between two padded leather boards. In another, small clothes pegs are attached to the skin of the penis in two lines, all the way along each side of the hard shaft, meeting at the base of the head as they wrap around towards each other in a kind of crown. Another shows a hard cock being pulled left to right and left to right by small individual nooses attached along its shaft, contorting the usually straight cock into a zigzag. I am reminded of a photograph by Robert Mapplethorpe in his 1978 series X Portfolio. It shows a penis strapped to a board, the cock and balls distorted by the tension of the cord which render it almost abstract. Blood, which shows black in the monochrome image, seems to emerge from the head of the penis and drips down haphazardly along its shaft. The balls appear as individual spheres. Each has cord wrapped so tightly around it they look as if they might pop. I can't remember now where I first saw this image, along with the other homoerotic sadomasochistic images in the X Portfolio, but I remember they were presented flat in a large vitrine which split the 13 images into 2 rows, each row facing out, so people walked around the vitrine, looking down onto the silver gelatin prints which sat high above the eyeline of most children, lest they be corrupted by the sight of a man pissing in another man's mouth, or of a man with the tip of his little finger pushed all the way into his urethra. I remember the lighting was low, which heightened their forbidden nature, and there was a kind of hushed atmosphere in the room, both a reverence to and a horror at the images. This was probably one of my first encounters with gay fetish images, and this one in particular had stuck in my mind, perhaps above all the others in the series. Mapplethorpe's work at that moment defined, for me, a gay fetish aesthetic. Looking at CBT Active's images now, cleaner, less dangerous, like something I might want to try, made me think about the way we assume our identities as gay men, trying these looks on for size, adopting appealing masculine symbols of denim, leather, jockstraps, sportswear, rubber, all imbued with generations of some unreachable meaning, as if part of a queer collective unconscious. I replied to CBT Active explaining my interest in tracing the history of the club back to its radical activist beginnings, and my idea to create an archive of the club and material relating to it. He quickly replies and tells me he organised a number of parties at the Vagevuur: SM Saturday evenings, SM Sunday afternoons, military and CBT parties. He invites me to visit him in Amsterdam, and we meet on a bridge over a canal in the west of the city. He is a sweet, unassuming guy, probably in his late 40s or early 50s. He has close-cropped sandy hair and wears military-influenced clothes, combat shorts, khaki t-shirt and dog tags. He introduces himself properly, D, and as he walks me to his apartment, I realise the anonymous meeting point was perhaps more for his benefit than mine, that I could have been anyone. Inside Dee's small, bright and modern apartment, what nerves I had disappear as soon as we start talking. Vagevuur was the only place that felt like home to me, he says. I immediately want to record the conversation, but he asks me not to. We speak for about 2 hours about the club, what it was like, and what happened to it. Afterwards, I quickly write down some impressions of our conversation. The space was mostly comprised of a large cellar, which was divided into different spaces by a labyrinthine series of walls. The bar was upstairs, a smaller space, but which also contained a large wheel which people could be attached to. The decor of the club would be changed to correspond with the particular event that was happening. Different people or organisations organised different events. The club was volunteer-run, the smell was neutral. Dario was going when he was pretty young. He didn't go to every party. People generally went to the night that they corresponded to. The dress code was very strict. Doors were open for an hour, then no one else was allowed entry. Safe sex was the rule, and no drugs. Anyone seen fucking without a condom or on drugs was removed from the club. If you didn't match the dress code, you would only be allowed in naked. It was sociable. One would tend to partner off. There was no expectation to take part in huge orgies involving everyone. Their regular water sports and fisting parties were most popular, along with their biannual scat parties with up to 200 people attending. It was a safe space. All the rules were there in order to allow like-minded people to enjoy themselves without judgment. Email from Harry, 26th of February 2019, 11:35 a.m. Hello Sam. Pink Triangle was activist. Vagevuur was not. It was an underground subculture, and that was a conscious choice. We have never sought the publicity or allowed media. None of the employees in any way have ever given permission for public access to images or text outside their own circuit. After we were forced into publicity, we immediately closed. I spoke to one former board member. He would also find it very annoying if history were to be revived. So it's not about skystorming, but about my responsibility to protect former employees who participated in the subculture and never intended to make things public. It was underground, not public. I myself have distanced myself. Hopefully you respect that, and references, location and people are not included in the project. Greetings, Harry. What do you do with a history that doesn't want to be told? The restrictions placed on the Vagevuur material by its former manager, Harry, make sense to me. These films and publications were produced for a highly specific audience, an audience that actively contributed to the subculture of fetish that Vagevuur was creating a space for. Their films were produced by, directed by, starred members of the community, all eager to facilitate the fantasies of their community. But what happens when you take these films and images and place them in a museum, making them available to a general public? How does a general audience, even a discerning and liberally minded art audience, respond to the sight of fisting, of cock and bull torture, of piss parties, of scat? What does it do to the material to remove it from the context in which it was created or intended? Or what purpose would abstracting it do either? I see this material as vital, the product of a politically inspired subculture who created a space uniquely their own, outside the usual commercial structures that define so many gay spaces. For 22 years, Harry and his volunteers made a success of Vagevuur and stayed true to their values. The material is not mine, and yet so much of it exists outside of the archive, so despite having collected a lot of it together, I have to question what I can ethically do with any of it. At the end point of this process, what really remains open and full of potential is my personal response to the subject. My own process, my growing relationship with sadomasochism, my interactions and new friendships, sexual encounters, the various frustrations, they have all become the subject. Towards the end of my second month in the residency, I confessed to Jasper, the archivist at ILIA, the LGBT Heritage Archive in Amsterdam, that my research had not been entirely academic, that it had become personal too. "What took you so long?" he asked, telling me that it had been clear to him from the beginning just how personal his research was. The next time we met, he brought with him a book from his library. Edited by Mark Thompson and published in 1991, Leatherfolk is a collection of essays exploring cultural, historical, and personal significance of SM from both straight and gay perspectives. One essay in particular really stood out for me: SM and the Psychology of Gay Male Initiation, an Archetypal Perspective, by Robert M. Hopke. In his text, Hopke, a Jungian psychotherapist based in Berkeley, California, draws links between gay male SM initiation rituals and the traditional tribal initiation and puberty rites, revealing their parallel qualities in order to show how, through SM rituals, gay men can find deep connections to their community, collective history, and their own body. He highlights the 3 stages of initiation typically applied to tribal rites: separation, transition, and incorporation, suggesting that they are a close match to the structure of many SM scenes. I quote, "The stage of transition is inaugurated within SM scenes in a way uncannily similar to the kinds of bodily torments and manipulations that, in native cultures, are meant to develop the limits of the initiate's endurance and usher him into masculinity out of boyhood. Suspension, piercing, penis and testicle stretching, cutting, tattooing, and semen ingestion. Likewise, the stage of transition, in which the initiate is on the threshold between who he has been and to who he will become, is often likened to a state of death, a liminal state. Both in gay male SM and in native cultures, therefore, we come upon appropriate ritual markers for the death-like, liminal aspect of this stage as well: bondage, mummification, confinement to closets, and of course the shrouding of the body in black leather." End quote. It was while researching this essay that I finally began to understand myself in relation to my research, and to see the ways in which artistic research can function beyond the externalized, project-oriented outcome, in a way that is deeply personal and corporeal. While I already understood my own aesthetic and political appreciation of Vagevuur, I had begun to push my own boundaries into the realm of SM, I now began to see the research itself as a process of individuation. I began to map my own journey onto the history of Vagevuur, onto the 3-act structure of the initiation rites: separation, transition, and incorporation, and then saw that my research had in a lot of ways functioned as a kind of SM initiation, through the acquiring of knowledge and practice. My separation occurred in my move to Eindhoven. I sought the knowledge and guidance of a number of older men whose access to the history I was researching put them in the authoritative master role. I was the eager initiate seeking to find a truth that would somehow transform me through the creation of a new work. Spaces like the LGBT archive, Dee's home, and Gert and Matthias's library became playrooms of intergenerational transmission of knowledge, where I was suspended in and moved through the liminal space between not knowing and understanding. In John's home, in the original Vagevuur no less, my body was literally suspended in his leather sling, my legs held open to receiving him and his knowledge and skill at giving pain and pleasure. I started to see SM as an invocation of the past, a way to connect myself to older generations both intellectually and sexually. The understanding of these SM rites also connected me to the dead too, through those generations of hidden meanings that were now marking my body. My incorporation came from the recognition of my new masters, who accepted me in these spaces, but also from my own understanding of myself in relation to the subject. The process of researching Vagevuur connected me to a long since dispersed community. It provided me with intellectual and sexual sustenance in the process of formulating my identity and assigning it a lineage. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam. I have some thoughts, but maybe someone else does first. Sam, maybe you could say a little bit about the proposal you wrote to us was very different from what came out. Firstly, just a beautiful piece of writing and text. Thanks so much. And it's really there's so much to digest there, and I'm so pleased to have a chance to publish something. It might not be that, but incredible text. But maybe could you talk a little bit about how you began with a proposition and it changed quite radically, but just that process a little bit of how that happened and why, and like leaving behind, being open, I guess, to being taken on this journey with the research, and maybe a kind of a moment or a tipping point where that process kind of unfolded in a particular way.
Okay, thank you. So I initially proposed that I would be exploring rural gay communes, which is so much more wholesome than what I ended up happening. Although some of these communes, you'd be surprised. Or maybe not surprised. But I'd spent a lot of last year going around rural England in my car and with my microphone, interviewing guys that were connected to this community of men that initially wanted to create a commune and then eventually set up this kind of more nebulous community that comes together at certain periods and then essentially go back to where they live. And often these men don't actually live in the countryside, they come from cities, but the countryside is where they collect. And they started doing that in the 70s, and I was fascinated in why my feelings in the present moment. I'd also moved to the countryside. I was exploring what it meant to be a gay man living in this kind of landscape where I had obviously a very kind of physical connection to the landscape, but I was trying to figure out what it meant as a gay man who has defined his identity in relation to a city. And so I had a lot of research to bring here, and I remember we talked about applying that research to the Netherlands. And there was really nothing here. I mean, because maybe this is an assumption, but the Netherlands being as flat and agricultural as it is, just no one was very inspired to go to the countryside. And if they did, they were probably doing it somewhere else. What we did find, I was working a lot with Jasper Wiedemann at the Ilia Archive, who is an amazing man, has been such an instrumental part of this process for me. And we found a group of radical fairies who were going to Schilling in the north, but it was like a holiday island. It was it wasn't, for me that wasn't interesting. And then Jasper suggested, maybe you should check out the Rosa Driehoek. They used to kind of go off in their pink caravan, cause trouble around rural areas of the Netherlands. And this kind of this idea of the activist group was very appealing, so that was where that then started. And then my friend Matthew texted me saying, Eindhoven used to have the dirtiest gay club in the world. And I was like, holy shit. Used to was the sad part, but, you know.
Yeah. Sod the countryside. Any questions from the audience?
Hi.
Hi.
I wanted to say thank you. It's so lovely to hear you recount your experience of research in a way that is emotional as well as informative. So I really appreciated that, and that kind of like storytelling aspect to it, and then also your emotional intelligence coming into play was really beautiful to listen to.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you find it difficult, or how you sort of convey that within your research in a like academic structure, like that your research seems to have been like not only academic but also experiential and embodied, and I was kind of wondering how you navigate that tension.
So this is the first time this has kind of found structure or form. I traditionally work with publications in film, and those were both potential outcomes for this project, and writing is something I really enjoy doing, as torturous as it is. So I knew that text would be important to this process. I'm not academic, so that is maybe, I appreciate academic writing, so maybe if there's any kind of connection there, it's through that. But this really is the first time this has found a kind of form and an audience, actually. And last night I had like 7,000 words, and I was like, that's not 20 minutes. And I was trying to figure out how the hell to make it work, and ultimately this more fragmented way just felt natural. And the whole process has been so kind of all over the place. I have a lot of documentation, but a lot of it isn't formalised, so I have some interviews, some people didn't want to be interviewed. And I think showing that side of it would be interesting too, but obviously then the restrictions on it are so intense. This is why I chose all these stills from the films where you can actually, there's either no people or they're very hard to see. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Ish.
I'm wondering if you visited the site. This is just a very quick question, and maybe it doesn't hold any...
Yes, I've been to both. The first one on the address that I can give, which is Hemmelreichen, and the second one on the address that I can't give,
Okay.
where the manager still lives.
Right.
I maybe unwisely went there unannounced to talk to him. But you know, I can understand his reluctance. Yeah. But the gentleman that I described having an amazing kind of encounter with lives in the building that was the first one. So he and his ex-partner bought that when the club moved. And so I had this strange experience of being in a home that used to be the fetish club.
Can I have a follow-up question? Sorry. I can just shout
You
it.
can just shout.
Yeah.
Just for the recording.
Okay. Were they, prior to them being fetish clubs, were they domestic spaces, or were they in commercial spaces or industrial spaces that then got turned into homes afterwards?
Yeah, the first one I think had been domestic and then had been extended and was like a children's creche at some point. And then the council owned that building and wanted the activists off the street in the 80s. They were like, this is information coming from Luke here, who was also fantastic and really useful in my research and very generous with his own research. He's kind of documented the whole history of Rosa Driehoek and gay Eindhoven.
Got a couple more questions, so we move through.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. I was really pained by the idea about this is not an activist space, this is not activist work, and I think like thinking about my own relationship to the BDSM and the kink community, and about how it is also transformative work, and it is one of the places where I feel the most grounded in and connected to a sense of queer community. I think that there's also this kind of pedagogic impulse when we have to talk about the parts of our community that we don't want straight people to have access to, or we don't want to have to do the thing that we force trans people, people living with HIV, people of color, to like indigenous people, to like sex working people, people with disabilities, et cetera, like when to name how you can exist and how this thing is important to you, the functioning of your being. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about your, like, the fuckery of that vibration between like actually having to come and make this presentation as opposed to just jerking off about it. And Anthony wants to say something because we come in a
Okay, so our question is kind of two-part, and the short way of saying that is, how do you tell the story that doesn't want to be told?
Yeah.
I think we in our own work and research and sexual life have often thought like there's things that we don't want to be revealed, and in some ways like have a certain question when other members of the community do choose to reveal things that we hold dear or that we reserve outside of the sphere of cultural production. And so I guess we're just excited, thank you, and answer our question. We're curious about your answer to our question.
Thank you both. These were questions I think I hadn't really considered before in my work. Like, so much of my work is kind of safely, archived on a shelf somewhere, and that somehow feels, the process of revealing that to people is a process of trying to connect that feeling of discovery and the excitement I have when I'm going through archives and narratives in the archive. And so dealing with such a recent history and with people and kind of the messiness that the research involved, that was kind of new to me. I had a bit of a hint of it last year with the commune, but this was really like on the next level. And it really occurred to me fairly late in this process, because I was like, I really want to share this material, it's amazing. Like, I really wanted, Nick and I were like powering ahead with a library presentation of so much material. And then that email came from Harry and it was like, fuck. And then I really had to like step back and really kind of go over my feelings about this material and why did I want to show it. And I wanted to see it, but I think I'm the perfect audience.
Others want to see it too.
Yeah, but what would it actually do? And I kind of decided that actually my process, my experience then became most important, or at least the kind of the part I could share. I even felt weird about showing some stills. I kind of maybe didn't need to do that, maybe I did, but I don't know. That's still a question about this space, whether this was almost too revealing as well.
I think there's one more question.
We've got two.
I'm very interested to know, because we will always have an expanding LGBT or queer or gay community, but you are describing, I would say, a disappearing community. So how does it, because and all these perverts have never entered the LGBT community with their suffixes, with the LGBT, with the P's and the SM's and whatever you have.
Yeah.
And so can you tell something about how these two communities relate to each other? So the LGBT people that are expanding and growing, and this pervert community that is more or less disappearing, apparently.
Well, I would like to challenge the idea that we perverts are disappearing. I think our spaces are disappearing. But I think we are probably a constant number of perverts, if not a growing number of perverts. But And this is definitely what I noticed when I put myself into the space of online communities, and actually it's so much easier to meet other perverts of any number of predications.
But they need visibility. Where's the visibility of the perverts now?
But I see your point of kind of the LGBT movement becoming more of a kind of conservative, homo-normative movement. I don't know if anyone's seen the cover of Time magazine this month. You'll get it if you see it. But I think the gay movement has tried to push this difficult side of things away and present a very different side of it. And those that want to do that, they can do that. But I think certainly in my work and in my process, the pervert side always wins, I guess.